This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Ghannam.
And I'm Jamal Dajani.
Jamal, we have an incredible show today, actually. There's quite a bit of news to talk about. We're going to be starting with a really incredible interview with Miko Peled, who's going to be talking about some recent polling evidence to show that even Jewish Americans see the Israeli state as an apartheid state. Really incredible stuff. And he's going to talk about that and the apartheid or racist citizenship law. And then probably really interesting news for you and I to talk about is that there are political protests and unrest going on in the West Bank, really kind of confronting the Palestinian Authority for the first time in a long time, which really speaks to the things that we've been talking about for many years now. And then finally, you and I should reflect a little bit on perhaps, historically, which many people don't realize, on the birth of Arab Talk with KPOO goes back to Terry Collins, who actually passed away recently. And Terry is a legendary figure in the activism community. And we're going to talk a little bit about Terry too.
That's right. And, we're going to begin with an interview with Miko Peled. He's, of course, a human rights activist and an author. And, he's going to examine this new poll. He might have a little bit of a different perspective on it. Also on Israel's racist citizenship law, which is actually was debated in the Knesset just a few days ago. So let's listen to Miko Peled. A survey of U.S. Jewish voters taken after the Israel-Gaza conflict finds that a sizable minority believes some of the harshest criticisms of Israel, including that it is committing genocide and apartheid. Among respondents to the survey commissioned by the Jewish Electorate Institute, a group led by prominent Jewish Democrats, 34% agreed that Israel's treatment of Palestinians is similar to racism in the United States. 25% agree that Israel is an apartheid state, and 22% agree that Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians. Joining us to discuss this and more, Miko Peled. Miko is a writer and human rights activist born in Jerusalem. He is the author of the books The General's Son, The Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, and Injustice, the story of the Holy Land Foundation. Welcome again to Arab Talk, Miko.
Thank you. It's good to be with you again.
So how accurate is this poll? Is this really a reflection on American Jews in this country? And are you surprised actually by it?
Well, first, thanks for having me again on the show. As they say, it's better to come late than not to show up at all. And so, the world has known that Israel is an apartheid state for a very long time. Palestinians have certainly known that Israel is an apartheid state since 1948. And so a portion of American Jews have decided to come to the party. It's 75 years late, but at least they're here now. Look, I think it's not a question of knowing. I think it's a question of, number one, caring, and number two, understanding why it's important. I think the more Jewish people and more American politicians too understand that Israel is an apartheid state. They just don't think there's anything wrong with that. In other words, they think it's okay, which is the problem. It's like it's when you talk to liberal Zionists, they oppose racism, they oppose apartheid, except in one instance, in one situation where Israel is concerned. So there's always a but at the end. When I talk to liberal Zionists, they will say, I agree with you 95%. And that 5% that we disagree on is that apartheid is wrong in Palestine too. that the genocide of the Palestinians is wrong, just like the genocide of other people. So that's usually the point where they disagree. Nobody will admit that they think apartheid is good. Nobody will admit that racism and genocide and ethnic cleansing is good. But Israel gets a break. Why? Well, because then they have all these explanations why Israel gets a break. But
well, I think it's very important. How do they justify this to themselves? As you know, the history of civil rights in this country, many Jewish activists were in the forefront of the civil rights movement. And then when it comes to Palestine, as you've said, they're willing to give Israel as a pass. Give Israel a pass. And my question is, how do they justify it? Is it based on ideology? Is it based on religion? How do they justify it to themselves?
Well, the entire Zionist narrative is built on justifying apartheid and genocide and ethnic cleansing. That's what the entire Zionist narrative is about. That's why you've got the narrative that says that all Jewish people are descendants of the ancient Hebrews from 3,000 years ago. Even if it is true, that still doesn't justify the ethnic cleansing, the apartheid. But they allow that to come in and say, well, we were here first, so it's okay. Like Naftali Bennett said with Mehdi Hassan, read the Bible. Never mind, the Bible doesn't say that God gave Israel the land. It has nothing, never mind the fact that it's not even true if you believe it. But, that's their narrative. We are here first, so we are allowed to do this. Then you've got the Holocaust. If that doesn't work, then they bring back the Holocaust. They say, well, the Holocaust showed us that Jews don't have a choice, which is, of course, complete nonsense. The vast majority of Holocaust survivors were not Zionists. They did not go to Israel. The vast majority of Holocaust survivors, over 90%, either went back to Europe or came to America, to other places. So obviously, this argument doesn't hold, but they throw all these arguments and then they throw in anti-Semitism and then throw this. The entire narrative, the entire Hasbara, the Zionist PR system is built in order to justify and say, well, yes, we supported human rights. We were supported the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. We support civil rights in America. We send, rescue teams to wherever there's an earthquake or natural disaster. The Israeli military is always there to save. But in the case of Israel, we have a special dispensation. We're allowed to do what we want to the Palestinians. That's exactly what it is. That's exactly why they have this particular narrative.
You said you welcomed you welcomed the latecomers to the party, meaning. Isn't it good news now that we have this poll conducted by a Jewish organization that they are admitting that there is still 25%, that's a quarter of American Jews in this country. And the numbers actually go higher the younger the age is. Isn't this, is this kind of a glimmer of hope that the whole mentality, at least with the young generation in the United States, is changing? Hence, we're going to see more people getting more vocal in their opinion.
Well, that depends. I don't know. If it makes a difference, if they act, then yes. If they sit down and they don't act, they only answer the poll, then it makes no difference whatsoever. So just because they say they think a certain way, we're not there yet. When they stand up, when they demand that their congressmen, when they demand that their elected officials boycott Israel, when they demand sanctions against Israel, when they demand that Zionism, that there be no tolerance for Zionism anywhere, then yes, then that's significant. But if they sit at home and just answer a poll, it means nothing to anybody. So it all depends on what they do with this opinion of theirs. Just because they have an opinion, it doesn't make any difference whatsoever. Many people can have an opinion. But in America, the Zionists learned something very, very important very early on. That in America, all politics is local. That's why anybody almost running for school board of a city, school board, will get an invitation, will be sent information by the different Zionist organizations in every state. Running for school board, for city council, for mayor, for police chief, for sheriff, everybody in local politics gets some kind of a touch, a message, an invitation from the Zionists. And they do it in a very pleasant way. They do it in a very nice way, and so it's hard to say no. every mayor, of course. And then it goes up the chain, of course, state legislatures, and so on and so on. So they understand this, and this is what matters. So if these Jewish people, 25%, if it's really that much, stand up and say, in our school board, in our city, we do not want any Zionists. We want to make it absolutely clear. We want to see a vow that they will reject Zionism because Zionism is a racist, violent ideology. Well, then, of course, it makes a difference. But if they don't say that, if like Bernie Sanders, they stand up and they say, well, we need to tone down the rhetoric. Tone down the rhetoric as Israel is bombing and slaughtering people in Gaza. Why tone down the rhetoric now? Why tone down rhetoric at all about Palestine? So it all depends on what they do with this. It all depends on how they move forward with it.
Action speaks louder than words. That's
absolutely
what you're saying. Moving on to the Citizenship and Entry into Israel law, the Israeli government recently failed to renew its controversial Citizenship and Entry into Israel law. The law, for those who don't know, prevents Palestinian spouses from living together legally in occupied East Jerusalem or Israel proper if one partner is from the West Bank and the other is from Jerusalem or Israel. They basically need a permit. They cannot live together. It also prevents Palestinians who are married to Palestinians with Israeli citizenship from being naturalized, unlike the spouses of Jewish citizens who are allowed to apply for Israeli citizenship. As you know, Jews from across the globe automatically are entitled to apply for Israeli citizenship. It's a little bit confusing for a lot of people who don't know like what's going on. It sounded like it was a victory, what happened recently in the Israeli Knesset, but it's not. Explain why.
Well, the politics right now within Israel, within the state of Israel, is that Benjamin Netanyahu is forging his way back to the prime minister's seat. That's really what all of Israeli politics is about right now. One thing, how to get Benjamin Netanyahu back into his seat. The current government has no majority. It's relying on some what they consider left wing and some Palestinian members of the Knesset and so on. And so, but it's a right-wing government. It's a government that actually ideologically is aligned with Benjamin Netanyahu and his what's called the right-wing bloc, which is almost half of the Knesset, which represents a large part of the electorate. The vast majority of the Israeli electorate is far right-wing, very radical, very fanatic Zionists. But they're running against each other. So they need Netanyahu's support and his right-wing bloc support for their legislation, for their agenda, because they are a right-wing government led by a fanatic right-wing prime minister, Naftali Bennett. So it creates these very, very strange political reality in Palestine right now, in occupied Palestine, in Israeli politics right now. I don't think there's any doubt Netanyahu is going to come back, and probably sooner than most people think. But when you have an issue like this, which is basically a very basic Zionist issue, how to continue the racist policies, how to maintain and strengthen the apartheid regime, at first they said this law is necessary, or this section of the law, which prevents Palestinians who marry Palestinians who are not citizens of Israel from marrying Palestinians who are citizens of Israel and living in Israel, is security, because how do you know if they're not a terrorist? I mean, any Palestinian could be a terrorist. So that was kind of the security mask. But that was originally. Now they're not even saying that. They're saying, no, this is demographic threat. We really want all these masses of Palestinians marrying citizens of Israel and taking advantage of the status, and we'll have this masses of Palestinians coming into our country. But it's all based on the inner workings of the apartheid regime, as though the West Bank is not a part of Israel, as though the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem are somehow independent entities. It's all governed by Israel. It's all one state. It's just an apartheid system that treats some people with privilege and some people without the privilege. So this notion that somehow these people who live in a particular area can retain a citizenship, but no more than a certain percentage. These people who live in another part of area, which they admit is Israel, they call it Judea and Samaria. We are not going to grant them citizenship, and then we're not even going to allow them to marry each other, even though they're governed by the same state, even though they live under the same state, we won't allow them to marry each other. Now, if an Israeli from Tel Aviv wants to marry an Israeli who lives in Judea and Samaria, in Hebron, for example, in the settlement in Hebron, there's no problem. It's only a problem if a Palestinian from the Naqab or Jaffa or somewhere wants to marry a Palestinian from Hebron, then that's not allowed. But, these are all parts of the inner workings of the apartheid system. It's all one state. They're all governed by the same government. If you're a Jew, you have the same rights everywhere. If you're a Palestinian, then, of course, your rights are determined by the specific geography. And that's part of this very complicated web of apartheid laws that exists there. And this is, again, they're to them, it's very natural to support this. For Israelis, don't see a problem with this. But I think it's important to break away from the Zionist perspective, from the Zionist paradigm, and see it as all one country, one state, governed by an apartheid regime who gives me all the privilege and denies that same privilege from you. Adijani, right? This is exactly what we're talking about. I mean, it is me and you. I get all the privilege, and I don't even know if you're allowed to return. Or, you know what I mean? That's exactly what we're talking about. It's a law that is designed for that.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And it's not even within historic Palestine, but also, for Palestinian diaspora who, lost their homes and towns and villages. And on this topic, last time we talked about the ethnic cleansing of Sheikh Jarrah. It's less in the news now, even though the ethnic cleansing continues. Shifted to Silwan. Silwan kind of made some headline. Again, it's now kind of like not much in the news. And I'm talking about here in the United States and internationally. And then recently I was reading in, I think, the Haaretz, now Israel has plans to build villas and housing for wealthy Israelis in the village of Lifta, which is, as you know, just like hundreds of Palestinian villages, was violently depopulated from its Palestinian inhabitants in 1948. And for some reason it was left alone, even though the village was destroyed, but left. Now all of a sudden the plans are back on the table to, I don't know, just maybe build another Beverly Hills or Herzliya, or I don't know. What's your take on this?
Well, I think what we've seen is an acceleration of the de-Arabizing of what's left of Jerusalem. So, of course, Lifta is right as you enter Jerusalem from the west, from the direction of Jaffa. And you can't really see it. It's hard to see sometimes from the main road, but if you pay attention, then you see the entire side of the hill entering as you enter Jerusalem. The houses are still there. There are many, many houses that are still there. And there are, a lot of several NGOs that are working to preserve it and protect it. And, and of course, then the Zionists who want to destroy it. And it's a beautiful area. It's a beautiful valley. And so, yes, it would be perfect for some kind of a wealthy neighborhood. But, we see that in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan and the Old City. This is part of the recreation of the Zionist what they believe is a recreation of this great Jewish Jerusalem, which for them needs to begin in Ramallah in the north and end in Bethlehem in the south, with Al-Aqsa compound in the center with the Jewish temple.
You're talking about Greater Jerusalem.
Yeah, so to them, this is part of the plan. This is all part of the plan. Well, having Lifta there, having these homes there empty and reminding people that there used to be Palestinians there is bad for business. It's bad for politics. So let's, build a beautiful neighborhood there, and people will forget. Let's get rid of Sheikh Jarrah with all its historical significance, to Palestinians, to Palestinian Jerusalemites and beyond, get rid of, all of that and build housing for settlers. Let's get rid of Silwan and continue this archaeological, mythological park that they're building, calling it the City of David. let's get rid of Palestinians from the old city, particularly the Muslim quarter, but from the old city in general, and occupy it with settlers. This is all part of the same thing. And of course, it's been going on for many years. And like you say, sometimes something peaks and then we hear about it. And then it dies down. It's not that it stopped. The violence in Sheikh Jarrah did not stop. In Silwan, it's been going on for at least a decade, maybe even more. I can't even remember when was the first time I went to protest in Silwan, and to the Silwan Information Center. By the way, they have a very good website. I recommend people check it out. Silwan Information Center. Yeah, it's called, I believe. It's a great center. It's a great kind of a community center. And they get closed down, they get destroyed, they get arrested, and so on. And you walk down in Silwan. I was there in May. It's like the tension is disturbing. Even you just walk down the street, and more Israeli settlers and more Palestinians have been evicted, and so on. So this is all part of this greater plan to de-Arabize and Judaize all of Jerusalem and the greater Jerusalem, like you said.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. As far as coverage right here in the United States, these stories don't even make it, even when they peak. I mean, I get more of this coverage from the Israeli press, Channel 10 and Haaretz and wherever, than we get right here in the U.S. I mean, they don't talk about it. I don't think even the whole issue about Lifta has been even brought to anyone's attention here.
No, and it wouldn't. And again, it kind of goes back to that initial thing you said that we talked about the Jews suddenly discovering that there's an apartheid regime. Well, where are they? Jerusalem is being destroyed, and once it's destroyed, you're not going to be able to bring back the glorious Palestinian city, this glorious city that has a rich Muslim and Christian history and sites. And by the way, they destroy Muslim and Christian sites. All around Silwan, they've destroyed a great deal of archaeology that didn't fit their narrative. Because Silwan is just outside the old city, just as you come down from the Al-Aqsa and the Western Wall. They do that all the time. Well, where are these Jews? 2 million people living in a concentration camp in Gaza. Where are these Jews? Thousands of political prisoners, children being tortured. Iyad Burnat from Bilain, who became famous because he dedicated his life to peaceful, nonviolent resistance. His entire life, his 2 boys have been tortured for more than 2 months already. Where are these? Where are they? So from time to time, there's a small group here, a small group there, but 25%? Stand up, speak up. What are you waiting for? That's my question. All of this is taking place, and nothing is being said.
Well, maybe there is a change. I was I'm more hopeful by this poll than you are, obviously, because, we usually don't hear about these polls. I mean, we know there are organizations here that kind of have progressed, like Jewish Voice for Peace and others, but then actually now to see that there are numbers behind this. And I personally believe when they say 25%, maybe it's 50%, and the other 25% are just afraid. They know that it is apartheid, as you said, speak up. They're not, because they are afraid that the wrath of Zionist organizations will target them. We've seen this. I mean,
absolutely.
Many brave American Jews who actually support the Palestinian cause, they are banned from traveling into Israel, and they got deported from there. So, I'm actually curious. One final quick question, because you keep coming back to Netanyahu, and you have convinced me that Netanyahu is going to somehow return, and you just think that this whole charade, Bennett, Gantz, etc., that's just going to be a temporary placeholder for him. Just quickly, please explain why.
Well, if you look at the numbers, they don't have the numbers. They cannot pass any legislation. Now, this government is made of the most right-wing elements in Israeli politics, Naftali Bennett being the head, right? The people who voted for him didn't want him to sit with the Palestinians and with even Lapid, who was kind of a center, or whatever it's called, center-left or whatever. That's not what they voted for. They wanted a strong right-wing government, arguably with Netanyahu at its head and that entire right-wing bloc that he brings with him. Now, how do you pass legislation when you've got all these different groups within it and you don't even have a majority? At best, they have 60. They only were able to actually form a government because one Palestinian abstained. So they had 60 to 59. I mean, it's 60 to 59. I mean, that's not going to work. You can't do anything. And there's always a threat by one side or another that if they go through with a certain legislation, then that part of the coalition will collapse. And of course, Netanyahu is sitting there very happily with his arms open, waiting for this government to fall back into his arms and actually beg him to come back and lead. And I would guess it'll be some kind of a national unity government, which would have a very broad coalition, maybe as many as 70 or even 80 members of Knesset. And then Netanyahu will really be able to do whatever he wants, and he won't need the Palestinians. He doesn't want Mansour Abbas and Ra'am. He doesn't want Meretz, even though they seem to be doing fine with Bennett. So this is not a government that can function. And they're pretending that they're functioning, that every minister has his Twitter account and they're showing all their achievements, even though they've only been in office a few days. It has no chance. And Netanyahu is very, very patient man. He's a very powerful man. He holds all the strings. He's the one really that holds the stability right now of the Zionist state. It's all in his hands. And I have no doubt that he's going to come back very strong.
Miko Peled, as always, thank you for coming on Arab Talk.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, that's Miko Peled, Israeli human rights activist, speaking about recent polling. Saying that even Jewish Americans see Israel as an apartheid state, but really drilling down on the racist so-called citizenship laws, which privilege one class of citizens in Israel over another, specifically Jewish citizens, to the detriment of all other citizens who happen not to be Jewish, Muslim, Christian, any other religion. So a very kind of powerful, wide-ranging interview, Jamal.
That's right, Jess. So we've been talking about this topic for ages.
Forever.
And many things have been kind of, closing in on this whole myth that Israel is a democracy. Because every time you raise these issues, of course, the Hasbaristas, as we call them right here in the United States, and Israel surrogates in Congress or AIPAC, they'll come up with a new concoction or new story to whitewash Israel's image. So remember just this poll, which was conducted just a few days ago. It's very important, and it's conducted by a Jewish organization.
Right.
Found that 25% of U.S. Jews believe that Israel is an apartheid state.
But Jamal, that's extraordinary.
And the number goes up for those who are under the age of 40. So the number can reach up to 30%. Wow. And then they have a bunch of questions. Just it's very interesting for our audience to also look at this poll. Like people talk about comparing racism in Israel with racism in the United States. That's one thing. Talking about genocide, that Israel commits genocide against Palestinians. So there were a bunch of questions, but the average is 25%. They believe that Israel is an apartheid state, and it's a racist state, and it's just like at the same level of South Africa. Now, my conversation with Miko Peled that's why I said he has an interesting take. Of course, this is important, and the reason why I'm saying this is important, but it doesn't come in a vacuum. You and I have been talking about this for ages. We've done several shows about this topic, and within the past year, you had many things happening. B'Tselem said Israel is apartheid. You have Human Rights Watch declaring also Israel is apartheid. You have the ICC Criminal Court want to examine Israel's basically atrocities in Gaza. And so you have a lot of things. It didn't come out of a vacuum. And every report that came, AIPAC, and again, I said it's surrogates in Congress, just wanted to brush it under the rug. They just ignore it and just give this Israel exceptionalism that we talked about. Now, Miko Peled said, yes, it is encouraging to have this news. And he says, his own words, better late than never. But he also questions, okay, it's good to say this pause, but what are you doing about it? So it's basically he's saying action speaks louder than words. Like, okay, you could have these polls, now the number is 25%, maybe next year will be 30%, but if the majority remains silent, because, the history of Jews in the United States has been very proactive, supporting the civil rights movement, very proactive, active criticizing apartheid in South Africa, but by and large, silent about apartheid in Israel. And so that's what he was questioning, which I feel is very important because, as you know, Miko Peled is Israeli, he's Jewish, and he's very critical of apartheid in Israel.
Yeah, and Miko's voice is very important, and his analysis is very important. And usually I'm the one who's more pessimistic in Arab talk, but I have to tell you, Jamal, listening to Miko and looking at these results, I was not as pessimistic as I usually am, because I'll go back to what you said before. The walls are closing in on the apartheid regime of Israel. And if you look at that data more carefully, there's a gap in terms of, Jewish Americans and their age, because as Jewish Americans grow up in the United States, they get exposed to the history of Israeli apartheid, they get exposed to human and civil rights in this country and progressive discussions about what's happening. They're changing their ideas. They don't have the same feeling and attachment to the apartheid regime that the older generation of Jewish Americans have. So I'm actually encouraged. I was actually surprised that it's 25%, because the question, Jamal, was not, do you have some concerns about the state of Israel, blah, blah, blah. It's, do you see the Israeli state as an apartheid state? That's an extremely strong statement. Now, we know that B'Tselem has come out and said that. We know that Human Rights Watch. We know about the ICC. But for this to filter down to 25% of Jewish Americans, I believe, is very significant. Now, to the point about words are, actions are stronger than words. Yeah, of course, because where this has to get through, Jamal, is because, as usual, the U.S. Congress, the Senate, and the House are way behind, where their electorate are. I mean, the congressmen and the senators are so far behind on this issue that it's going to be an uphill battle to get them to, see the reality. And the only way they will, Jamal, and you and I know this, it has to cost them politically to continue to support an apartheid regime.
You're absolutely right. And unfortunately, it has not cost them politically. Instead, they still keep drawing on the
AIPAC money.
AIPAC support, and that's what they're looking at.
Right.
And sadly, they're going to go in the garbage bin of history, because
that's right.
They've been wrong before, and they will be wrong again, as we see the rest of the world. The world is waking up to this, and people are facing the reality. Miko also discussed Israel's citizenship law, which basically
so-called citizenship,
which was debated a couple of weeks ago in the Israeli Knesset. But then again, here's another example where he and I talked about, and Miko was born in Jerusalem. I was born in Jerusalem, so that's the example. He can go in and out, no problem, even though he's a critic. But also, if you're a Palestinian, and that's the most important thing about the law, if you marry someone, if you're from the West Bank and you got married to a Palestinian, let's say from Jaffa or Haifa, you have a problem.
That's right.
Or if you marry someone from Ramallah, you have a problem. There is no reunification of family when, on the other hand, any Jewish Israeli can marry someone from anywhere and bring him or her to the country, and they become automatically an Israeli citizen. So you have a lot of things, and he said initially when Israel, of course, came up with this law, they basically cited security, like, all Palestinians are terrorists. So if you're a Palestinian living, let's say, in Haifa, and you married a Palestinian from Ramallah, then your wife...
It's a security threat.
It's a security threat. Of course, we know that this is such a racist attitude to begin with, but anyway, that's not the case. The case is really controlling the demographic and controlling Jewish majority, which they publicly talk about in the Knesset. Politicians talk about Jewish majority.
Jamal, the Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, has talked about this the entirety of his political career. He's advocated now the Prime Minister has advocated for having less, so, in quotes we say less Arabs, fewer Arabs, meaning no more Palestinians in historic Palestine. It would be accurate to say this is the stated policy of the apartheid regime of Israel now, isn't it?
It is. It's very obvious. And then yet you have defenders in Congress on both sides of the aisle. I mean, those who will be critical, because we know in the United States we have this, also people have this sentiment, like, let's maintain a white majority in this country. We know who they are. It's not it's not a policy of this country. There is that sentiment amongst a group of the population. Nevertheless, imagine if in Congress the Speaker of the House or the President of the United States or the Vice President of the United States says something like, we need to maintain a white majority in this country. What will happen?
Yeah. But I hate to break this to you, Jamal. We're not that far away from that being said.
Yeah, but it's not policy. We know
it's not policy yet, but we are.
The Trumpsters would love to do that.
But just to make the comparison, it would be outrageous. That was a stated policy behind, the secession of the Confederacy during the time of, leading up to the Civil War and afterwards. But you're exactly right.
Well, Israel seems to be living in the Confederacy time.
They absolutely are living in the Confederacy. But they don't want to secede, Jamal. They actually just want to get rid of the indigenous communities in historic Palestine. Just like indigenous communities here in the United States were ethnically cleansed and African Americans were put into slavery. I mean, we've been making that analogy for many, many years. And the more evidence we see, the more social media gets out, the more we hear from Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem and other Israeli human rights activists, the more what we've been saying for many years is coming true, that the apartheid regime of Israel is a racist state built on racist principles, built on ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, with a racist citizenship policy. And you're exactly right. The people in Congress who continue to support this apartheid regime will be relegated to the dustbin of history, just like, previous racist regimes. There's no doubt about it. It's just a question, Jamal, I think, of how fast, how soon, how quickly that'll happen.
You're listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco, 89.5 FM. I want to shift gear here, Jess.
Yeah, Jamal, I want to ask you about this because this is really very interesting to me. You've been reading the Arab media, the press in Palestine. I mean, the fact that there are protests against the Palestinian Authority now and Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, this is kind of a big deal. And it comes after the heels of what we talked about, this political assassination or political murder, if you will, recently of a Palestinian activist. But it seems like there's a lot of unrest right now in the West Bank.
Yeah, so at least 70 Palestinians have been arrested since we last spoke, and as the protest broke out over Banat's death. And this is according to Lawyers for Justice, a local rights watch group, because, of course, the Palestinian Authority is not going to give you the numbers.
Right.
And then charges of sedition were brought against 29 of them. I mean,
that's unbelievable.
I mean, this is why the excuse that they've put forward for their arrest. Palestinian human rights organizations and civil society and international NGOs have collectively condemned these abuses and violence that we have been seeing in the past few weeks, Jess. Yet the oppression continues as we speak. It's really part and parcel of a systematic attempt by the PA to stifle political opposition and freedoms. I mean, that's the bottom line. They want no critics of either or both. I mean, Mahmoud Abbas persona as president, or the Palestinian Authority as a whole. And so, as you know, since the Oslo Accords were signed, the power of the Palestinian Authority, not in front of the international community, and not in front of Israel, but in controlling the West Bank, has exponentially grown after they limited Hamas into Gaza, after that split. But the biggest thing that grew, Jess, even with the financial problems, with the bad economy, with some of its aid, like U.S. aid stopping, then resuming, whatever, the only thing that we actually mentioned it many times, the only thing that didn't stop is money going to the Palestinian Authority's security.
That's right.
So the security sector in Palestine, and this shouldn't be a surprise to you, has a budget that is larger than education, larger than health, and larger than agriculture, the agriculture sectors combined.
Yeah.
So this is, this is why we're seeing this. And as we've discussed before, the security forces are, they're funded and trained by international donors in the United States, which several times stopped its U.S. aid. It never stopped never stopped the flow of money to the security forces. The EU, the United Kingdom, and Canada. They all put money, invest money, not in health, not in education, but they
not
put
in infrastructure.
An infrastructure. So it's really the security. So that's now we have this major issue is you have a weakened Palestinian Authority, meaning as far as healthcare, as far as running the country, as far as liberating an inch out of Palestine, basically, which they haven't. Instead, they've lost thousands and thousands of acres to settlers, especially in Area C. But the security forces keep growing. They keep getting money. They're well trained. And now they are directed by presidential orders to target people who criticize the government.
Well, the bad news about that, Jamal, there's good news and bad news. The bad news is there's a 100% chance that Abu Mazen, the Palestinian Authority, and his cronies attempting to do this to quiet Palestinians who object to this corrupt way of managing, Palestinian life is going to hurt. The bad news is it's going to hurt a lot of Palestinians. The good news is it will never work. And that we see regimes that do this or organized political groups that do this are typically when they feel like their power is slipping, when they feel like they've been backed into a corner, or they feel like they're near the end of their time. And I think, as you and I have said on many times here on Arab Talk, the Palestinian Authority, in terms of their ability to govern, to manage, and to improve the day-to-day life of Palestinians in the West Bank, let alone in Gaza, is gotten worse over the years, not better. So my question to you, why are they, they're not surprised that Palestinians are protesting this. They're not surprised, I'm sure, that murdering Nizar Banat is going to spark outrage among the entirety of the Palestinian community. So I know this is a hard question. Do you think this is a tipping point for the Palestinian Authority, or is this just a bump in the road?
I don't know if it's a tipping point, and I don't think it's just like a casual bump in the road. I think it's a wake-up call. And the wake-up, I think that's what it is. I think it's a wake-up call, and they are being put on notice that business as usual is not going to continue. You cannot keep silencing people who speak against you. You are being criticized by those people because you have done nothing since Oslo. In fact, the country has moved backward. All the dreams and the promises that you put, you presented to the public is not sitting well with them, right? And that's why they are criticizing Mahmood Abbas, who hasn't had an election now going on the fourth term. Technically, we call it a term. And,
right.
There is corruption, there is nepotism, there are a lot of things going on that people are unhappy about. The settlers' numbers have quadrupled.
Right.
People are seeing, whether if you live in Ramallah, you're not too far from Jerusalem to see that the Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah are getting ethnically cleansed, and there's nothing that the Palestinian Authority can do about it. I mean, not even a phone call. I mean, it's like, it's all talk. If you sign a peace agreement like with Oslo, you should have at least peace, and you don't have peace. You haven't provided peace. You haven't provided an independent state, and people are on a daily basis getting ethnically cleansed. Their land is stolen by settlers in Area C of the West Bank, which is the largest area, basically. And so I don't know what they're waiting for. I mean, to me, the big catastrophe will happen is eventually, as you know, Mahmoud Abbas is 85 years old, and no one lives forever. And there is no plan B. The authority, the so-called Palestinian Authority, has not put forward a plan B. And when plan A collapses, that's the big worry. Are we going to see a civil war? Or you got somebody like Bennett who's saying, I don't care, we'll take over the West Bank, we'll take over Gaza. Are we going to go to, a full control? Israel controls anyway the West Bank. But anyway, to have a public declaration that they will, continue the control. Jamal, that's a very good point. I happen to think that that's the most likely outcome. Because unfortunately, Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, and the Palestinian Authority have failed, as you said, to establish a succession plan, let alone, have free and fair elections. And because of that, when Abu Mazen, passes on, and as you said, he's not going to live forever, there's going to be chaos. Well, the question is that what are they waiting for? A miracle? The expression, repeating something over and over again and keep seeing and failing at it and keep repeating it is a sign of insanity, right?
Right, thinking that you're going to have a different outcome. Yeah, I think, Jamal, this is just I think, we're looking at maybe not full-blown civil war among Palestinians, but we're looking at a kind of chaos and fragmentation that will give people like Naftali Bennett and the Israeli, extremist parts of their government an opportunity to think that they can declare full annexation over the entirety of historic Palestine. I think that's a real possibility.
Yeah, so the message at the end, it's not like Palestinians hate the Palestinian Authority, because many of their cousins, brothers, sisters, etc., they're part and parcel of it. They work there.
That's right.
Many people who criticize the security forces, they have cousins and relatives who are part. They are just looking at them and saying, do something useful. Do something that can enhance our lives. And that's why they are criticizing those who are in charge.
Jamal, listen, it's not rocket science. It's true everywhere in the world. You want your life to be better. You want the life for your children to be better. You want safety for you and your family. You want access to healthcare and education. You want functioning infrastructure. These are just basic things that have been denied Palestinians in the beginning, and for the first and foremost because of the occupation. But the Palestinian Authority hasn't done anything, as you've said, and I agree completely. What have they delivered on since Oslo? More land has been stolen. More people have lost their homes. People's standard of living has gotten worse, not better. So what, do they really have a leg to stand on? I don't think so. And I think we're headed for some real chaotic times.
So, Jess, we are going to talk about a little bit of sad news, but also, we want to celebrate the life of Terry Collins.
An incredible human being. Man.
Terry, the co-founder, president, and volunteer programmer at KPOO, passed away last Wednesday night. You and I have known Terry for two decades at least.
At least, yeah.
And, I'm sure you have very memorable stories to tell about Terry.
Well, I think you and I have a lot of stories to tell, but before we get to the stories, our deepest condolences to the Collins family and to the community of KPO for losing such a heroic figure as Terry Collins. I mean, Terry Collins was part of the 1969 uprising, intifada, if you will, of San Francisco State and the creation of the Ethnic Studies Department. He was part of the Black Panther movement. He was someone who was a heroic fighter for human rights. He was part of the San Francisco, is it 8 or 9? I forget which one, but he's legendary in the African American community. And I think one of the things that maybe people on Arab Talk who may not know the birth of Arab Talk started with Terry Collins reaching out to you and I 16 years ago and asking, do you want to do something? Because we have this hour opening up at KPO, and he said, we don't feel like the Palestinian voice is heard enough, and we want that voice to be represented at KPOO and in the San Francisco Bay Area. So really, Arab Talk's birth and its evolution, in fact, owes itself to Terry Collins, and for that, I think you and I will be grateful to him and his memory forever.
Yeah, he stood for social justice. He also stood behind Ahmed program.
That's right.
And many times I would, outside KPO, of course, you and I used to see him all the time, pre-COVID, I should say, all the time at KPO. I used to run into him at San Francisco State University.
Right.
He was part of the spirit of 1969, basically, that created the School of Ethnic Studies there. But he was an ardent supporter of the Palestinian cause, and also wanted to make sure that the Ahmed program at San Francisco State University not only continue, but flourish. But I used to get a lot of enjoyment sitting with him and talking about his travels, Jess. This is something he didn't share, that Terry, as a young man, which was, very impressive because he didn't have any money to kind of just pack his bags and decide to travel to North Africa and the Middle East and just basically hitchhike his way in North Africa and go to Morocco. And he would tell me,
in the 60s.
Exactly. And he would tell me stories. He didn't, of course, speak the language, and very few people he encountered spoke English, but he managed to be a guest in many homes in North Africa, and he'll tell me funny stories about his adventures.
Yeah. And, Jamal, every time especially at the beginning when Terry's health was much better, when we would come in to do our shows, when we were doing them pre-COVID in studio, it would be Terry Collins who would be there at the desk, and we would have these very kind of engaged, lively political discussions about everything from Palestine to civil rights to slavery to, apartheid Israel. He was incredible in terms of the breadth and the depth of his understanding of the political, politics and the political struggles of people everywhere in the world. So I remember those conversations. He would give us a hard time if we failed to cover something on Arab Talk that he thought was very...
a text message.
He would send us text messages, and forever he was the one who was supporting Arab Talk. And as I said, I know that we'll be eternally grateful to Terry for his dedication to human rights, civil rights, and justice for everybody, but especially to giving Arab Talk and you and I the opportunity to start this, journey on KPOO and how it's expanded. We'll always be very grateful to Terry for that.
Well, we are dedicating this show to Terry Collins. You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we will see you next week.
See you next week.